We're going to start off with doing a little bit of Q&A. Then we'll go through a handful of personal statements, and then we'll take it from there. Who has a question that brought them here tonight regarding personal statements? Just raise your hand, and I'm happy to take care of it.
Thanks so much. Okay, Steve, really quick question. I know that the personal statement needs to maybe cover like an obstacle that you've overcome, and also maybe answer the question of why, like why a transition, especially if I'm moving from one career and I'm making a total switch. So my question is, is it important that the personal statement equally balances both of those topics, or just be maybe like really cover one of those really well? Like I heard an example of somebody wrote a personal statement of learning how to ride a bike to become a better team player. And I guess I'm curious, is like, does it have to like answer all of the questions for a personal statement, or be really good at one of those?
I would focus on doing one thing and doing one thing well. I'll actually get some examples in a little bit about how you could address various topics in different statements, but you don't want to limit it to one statement, and you don't want to limit it to one, you don't want to try and cram it all into one statement. It's too much. It's too much. So pick one thing, focus on it, go really deep on it. Other topics could be for separate personal statements or separate like diversity statement, character and fitness, optional essay or addenda of some kind, but I wouldn't try to do it all in one place. Thank you for that. Great question. Rianka?
So kind of like Alyssa's question, when you do have several things that you want to say that aren't necessarily reflected in your resume or any of the other things, kind of where's the playing field for how much you should say about all those different things? So let's say you can't talk about 7 things individually in there, but let's say you do want to do 2 or 3 things. Kind of how do you balance that out?
It's tough choices, but some things will be better for a personal statement. Some things will be better for a diversity statement. Other things, there might just not be room for it, period. And unfortunately, not every story can get told. If you've got 7 different things, there's not 7 different essays. So some things might be covered on a more surface level in the resume, but other things you might choose to go deeper on.
So is it kind of the equivalent of like a cover letter to a resume?
Not exactly.
Some of those things?
Not exactly. A cover letter is a cover letter. And in a way, a cover letter is simply highlighting a couple of key things from your resume in sentence form, but you're still not going deep on them. And it's also a completely different purpose. A cover letter is typically to get a job, right? It's expressing your interest in the job and calling out certain things about why your resume makes you a good fit for that job. Personal statement is totally different. The role there is to show a completely different side of yourself and help them get to know you better, and also to get them to like you.
Okay, that's fair. Thanks.
Yeah, of course. And we can talk about specific examples if you'd like. Are there certain things that you're considering as for being for one statement or another?
Yeah, so like for me, I'm coming from a completely different career, going into law. So I'm from the natural sciences. So like my resume and stuff would show those things, but not necessarily specific to like a job or something like that, just kind of generally speaking, which is why I kind of said the cover letter, where you like kind of bring in just a few of those elements that are kind of tied to the resume and they just expand on them a little bit. So that's more or less why I was asking that.
Yeah, I'd be coming at it from a different angle. I'd be thinking about what are some personal stories you want to share. Don't think about this in the job context. Think about this in a personal context, more like the things you might talk about in therapy, things you might talk about when you're doing deep work, journaling, diaries, things of that nature. And I know it's funny, but it should make you a little bit uncomfortable because you want to be emotionally compelling. And a cover letter for a job, it's not emotional. It's not going to make you cry. But I've read personal statements that got me choked up. And that's really, I think you want to get that powerful with it. And it's going to be uncomfortable. It's going to make you a little bit uneasy. But I think those are the best statements.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Yeah, of course.
Hi, my name's Sunny. I just have a quick question about the weight on the personal statements. So from my understanding, there is GPA, then the LSAT score, and then the personal statement. So is it split evenly, 33% for each section?
Not at all. Not at all. I would say it's probably something like 35 LSAT, 35 GPA, and then 30 everything else put together. That's a rough ballpark. I'm sure I've given different rough estimates in the past, but it's along those lines. It could be 40 LSAT, 30 GPA, then again, 30 everything else. So the personal statement the resume, the rec letters, all put together are maybe a third, maybe even less than that. That being said, though, you still want to give every part of the application your all.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
I have a question, Steve. Oh,
Go ahead.
thanks, Jasmine. I'm 38 years old, and so I suspect my undergrad GPA is going to be less of a foe. The personal statement, I'm guessing in my circumstance, is going to be a little more important. I wanted to ask about the suitability of a topic. I have been volunteering in the area supporting women in college coaching, and gender equity in sports is my passion, and that's what's driving me to want to go to law school. And so I'm thinking that'll give me the opportunity to include some personal stories and whatnot, and wanted to get your take on that.
Yeah, sure. So what are the stories?
I helped my friend. My friend got basically forced out of her job illegally when she became a mom. She was a woman coaching, and she got forced out. Helped her file her EEOC complaint, which her lawyer ended up using to help her get a settlement. And I can't really talk about. I can't really reveal too much data, but me helping her advocate for herself, which she's told me she wouldn't have done otherwise, started me down the path of research, going into research, and down, triggered all this stuff. So. Yeah.
That sounds cool. That sounds like great work. I would just make sure it's focused on you more than her story. So your journey as an advocate, navigating bureaucracies, navigating rules, researching, looking things up, figuring it out, and then how you changed as a person through your advocacy work. Don't make it all about her story.
Yeah, more of that being the catalyst and then what that did for me.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, I also
Jasmine?
have a question.
Shoot.
Related to how personal you should get with each law school. For example, if a law school is specialized in like medical law and that kind of practice, like would I want to gear my personal statement to kind of looking like that if I have that kind of background?
Yeah, you could bring that in. Yeah, I don't think you need to personalize different statements for every single school. They're not that concerned generally about which particular area of law you'll practice because they know it can change over time.
Yeah, okay, because I wasn't sure, because I had mentioned in my personal statement, like certain courses that I wanted to do in mediation, because I thought that that's something that, I really liked, that I thought was really needed, and I wasn't sure how much I could bring into my application.
Yeah, you can. You can bring that up as a closing in your main personal statement, or there may be room to talk about why this particular law school, and then list those particular courses there. Some schools have room for that, some don't. Some like to have it. Yale, of course, Emily, I know you're listening, doesn't like to have that. So that's one thing to be aware of. Yeah.
There's also just a follow-up question to that too. I had an editor look at my personal statement, and she does just, applications to grad schools just in general. And so she had told me as reference that, I should be adding what I could contribute to their school. So not just the narrative. And I was a little bit confused because I just thought, isn't this supposed to be something where I open up? So should it, and is it worth, I guess, kind of saying how I can contribute to their school as a student if I were to be a JD candidate there?
Your whole application talks about how you can contribute
Hello?
in yeah, I'm still here. Yeah. So your
Sorry.
whole application,
My internet's
choppy
bad.
connection. Yeah. You're really looking to, throughout your entire application, all parts of it are showing how you can contribute in one way or another. And so I think it's really not about like making the argument directly, again, showing, not telling. You're showing it through your various experiences, what's on your resume, what's in your personal statement, what's in any of your other essays. All of that is put together a very compelling package. So it'll come across, but you don't need to say, I'm going to be involved in this activity or that other activity. It's nice to mention to show you've done the research, but I wouldn't go about it so overtly.
Hi, Steve. Thanks for hosting this. And I just wanted to quickly follow up on Jasmine's question, which is similar to what I was thinking about. So I know that the majority of the statement should be focusing on telling a story. I was just wondering, is it worthwhile to kind of maybe in the last paragraph or so explicitly state how this ties to wanting to go to law school? Or should this all be kind of shown throughout the story that you're trying to tell?
I think it's typically better if it's a little bit more subtle, but if you want to tie it back together more directly in the conclusion of the essay, you can certainly do that. But it should be apparent that law school is a good idea for you at this moment in time, that it's the next natural step in helping you achieve your career goals. So we'll see some drafts. I know a lot of the drafts that I come across tend to do that. And if it's more organic and it flows naturally, that's great, but don't feel the obligation to do that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, of course.
I have another question,
Sure.
which is something I think about all the time. So I honestly sometimes don't know why I want to go to law school. If law school is the best thing for me, all that sort of thing. Is that something that's okay to say in there? Just be, I mean, because part of it's like figuring out what I want to do once I get there, having a general idea, but I don't really have any specifics about that. So at what point do you open up about that sort of vulnerability in a personal statement, or do you just completely avoid it?
I wouldn't consider that a vulnerability. I would consider that something you got to figure out now. So that's to me, that's more than a vulnerability. That's you making a 3-year commitment and a gamble of over $100,000 that you're not really sure about. And I know that there are a lot of people who are in this position. So this isn't particular to you. Certainly a lot of folks are in that situation where they're not really sure what to do with their careers. They majored in the humanities. So they're not going to go in a variety of other paths, but law school seems like a natural step when you're not sure what else to do, buys you some more time for 3 years, but it's an enormous investment of time and energy and dedication. And once you finish, that's your path. If you got a JD, you're going to want to do something in that area. And a lot of other things are actually no longer suitable options for you because they'll see that JD and they'll be like, well, why aren't you doing law? So it's important that at this very moment in time, you take some time, set it aside, and really think long and hard about why you want to go to law school. Take that time, think long and hard why you want to go to law school, why that is the best option for you right now, and do the research about law schools and what programs they offer and what sorts of jobs that naturally prepares you for. But given all the investment that you're going to make in that path, you've got to take the time to think about that.
So something that I need to do in my personal time. So is there any sort of that, let's just say I know I want to go to a general field. Do I just talk about that field in some sort of way and not just be like, I don't know if I want to be a blah, blah, blah lawyer or this or that, and just completely like sidestep that?
I would circle back first to just actually personal statement and application aside, really take some time to think about, one, why does law school appeal to you? Why does the practice of law appeal to you? And then secondly, look at your experiences up to this point, what you did in college. If you have work experience, what your work experience is like and how those sorts of skills tie into the kinds of skills that a lawyer uses. And then some potential paths you might want to take. And then after you've done that, then think about, okay, what are some compelling stories that would be good fits for personal statements? But I see these as two separate processes. The first step is if you decide whether law school is right for you at this moment in time, just because you're making a massive investment in your future and there's no backsies on this. If you invest a semester's worth of tuition in law school or a year's worth of tuition, both in the money and in the time, if you exit after that point, it's all thrown away. And maybe you had fun and it was a good time, but is that worth $25,000, $50,000 plus opportunity costs just for that experience, for it to be a good time? Not really. And law school really isn't a good time in a lot of ways. It's a lot of work. So take the time to think about whether you actually even want to really do this, or are there any one number of other things you could be doing instead? And then only if you decide that law school is right for you, then actually start thinking about, okay, I'm going to put together my application. But I think you're not even at the point yet where personal statement is the right thing for you to be thinking about yet.
That's fair. That's fair.
As a side note, I wrote a personal statement and it ended up being all about why I didn't want to go to law school. So I didn't apply. It was like 90% why I didn't have a lot of faith in international institutions like the United Nations after having done a lot of advocacy work there in the nonprofit sector. And I was kind of jaded and cynical about all of that. And then I was like, I don't like doing any of that stuff anymore. Guess I'll do something else with my legal career. And it's like, my brother's like, you don't really want to go to law school, do you? I'm like, I guess not. So that's what I figured out through that process. But I wasn't taking time to really think about why law school was good for me or why law was right for me. I just had a lot of experiences that were kind of sour on my view. So through that process, I actually discovered something about myself, and free writing can do that. So I would take some time to think about that.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Emily writes, we all need a Steve's brother asking the tough questions. And yeah, that's exactly right. And that's part of why having outside voices, outside feedback can really help, because it can be hard to see things for yourself sometimes. Other questions, Claudine?
Hi, yes. Thank you for doing this, by the way. So I am 41 years old, and I am going to law school. I'm applying, obviously, and I went to law school when I was 23. I did the whole thing. I got in, and I did my first year, and I failed out. And I've lived, like a whole long life in between then and now. And now I'm going to do it. I know what I want to do with it. I have all of that stuff. But how on earth am I going to convince these schools to take me back? Like, that's in my mind. Like, oh, she failed out. She wasn't able to do it. Like, why would they take me back? Even with all my passion and all that, like, I don't know. I get stuck when I get to that part.
Well, I guess I would ask what's changed for you. And it's been a very long time. It's like that's nearly half a lifetime, right? So a lot's happened, a lot of experiences you've learned and grown. So the question is, what's different now than back then? What's changed in your personal life? How have you grown? How have you matured?
Well, I guess like specifically like with the law, I got divorced. I had babies. I got them taken away. I got them back. My dad passed away, and I had a huge trust inheritance battle. So like those three things right there, I mean, I was, hit in the face with courtrooms and going to court and filing stuff and doing all these things that, when I went to law school the first time around, I remember being in Tor's class, and I was like, oh, this is so just very snobby kind of like immature attitude, where I didn't really understand what all this was for, but now I've lived it. And so if I can help, hold on one second. Can you guys sit out of the room, please? Out. Sorry, my kids. Now that I've lived it, I have that passion to be able to help. Whereas before, I didn't know what I wanted to do with it. I just went to law school just because. But I went and I didn't do well. So like, why am I going to do well this time?
That's up to you to figure out. That's up to you to tell them what's different specifically. And so having had kids, having been through various legal battles, what's changed for you? What's your understanding of the law, and what is your ability to commit to this process this time? I mean, it's not for me to tell you what's going to be different. I think that you've got to think about what's going to be different. As Janine's saying in the chat, you just said why. And so when we're recording this, it's going to be on YouTube. You can go back and watch this video, and you'll see exactly what you just said. Write that down and have that be a starting point for you to jump off and start going into more depth. But you've got to know the answer to that, because if you don't know, how are they going to know? You've got to be convinced that it's the right decision for you to go down this path once again, having been through a lot in the interim, to have a different experience.
Okay, thank you.
Of course, but I wouldn't be too concerned about, given how much time has passed, they will be able to understand that you're a different person now than you were back then. So don't assume that, like, it's not like it's been 6 months or a year later. Jasmine says you've got this, which I agree. And Emily says, after 5 years, your grades are expired. Don't you have that long to complete a degree? Well, I mean, LSAT scores are expired, but they still go off your undergrad GPA. The undergrad GPA is still there.
They still ask for your transcripts too.
Correct. Yes, so your GPA is still there. The undergrad transcript is still there. But having been a long time since then, they'll weigh that a little bit less heavily. They'll weigh the LSAT a little bit more, and they'll weigh the application and the soft factors a little bit more as well.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
We've got a question from Jenny here. How personal is too personal? Jenny, you want to share more on that?
I want to know, like, how personal is too personal. Like, say if you want to, like, you want to write about your story about how you want to get into law school and your personal life. Like, but I understand that, like, there should be like a line between what's personal and what's not. Like, how do you go by, like, not feeling petty or feeling like needy when writing your personal statement?
It's a good question. I think it's all about tone and perspective. I think you want to share enough that you feel a little bit uncomfortable doing it, because if you're not feeling uncomfortable, you're probably not going far enough. But at the same time, you don't want to go to the point of TMI, making them recoil. And you also don't want to be too emo about it. Like, you don't want this to be a pity party. You don't want this to just be complaining or making excuses. You can explain things, but you want to show another side of yourself. That's really what it's about. And Jasmine's pointing out resiliency. And I think that's exactly correct. I've talked about the idea of post-traumatic growth, the idea that you may have gone through something difficult, but how have you grown from the experience? What have you learned from it? As Jasmine says here, you can have a challenging situation, but show how powerful and strong it's made you. We've got a question from Mariam about differentiating between topics for personal statements and diversity. A lot of times there is overlap. One could be the other. Depends where you want to focus. And if you want to write both statements, personal statement is by default, everyone's going to write that. Diversity statement is optional. You can choose to write one or not. So if you have two topics, but one of them suitable for diversity statement, go with that. Take it in that direction. Do you want to share more, Mariam?
Hi, by the way.
Hi.
I'm kind of debating between what topics I want to write for each one, because for personal statement, I want to kind of focus on my immigration journey and like the legal battles between that. And then for diversity, I kind of want to talk about immigration as well as like first generation and where I come from and stuff like that. So I kind of felt like it was going to overlap. And I didn't know if it was okay or not.
Yeah, it's okay. They can overlap. Sometimes it's natural that they overlap, but you go much deeper in on one topic, and the other one, it's simply referenced in passing. And that's fine. I mean, they're going to read both of them. Typically, a lot of times by default, people assume diversity statements will be about race and ethnicity, and that is pretty common. It doesn't have to be limited to that only. But if you have a topic related to race or ethnicity, that's a good natural place to put as a diversity statement. And then something else could be for the main personal statement.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, of course.
I have two questions.
Sure.
Can you hear me? Okay. So the first one is, I've heard before, like, as an advice that if you can fill everything up, like do a diversity statement, do a personal statement, because the more stuff you put, you're giving like a more holistic view of yourself or a little more of yourself. And I wanted to see what your thoughts were about that. And then my second question is, who would be good candidates to have them read your personal statements and give you that feedback? In the past, I've used professors, but I don't know if that specifically. I've also heard some people say maybe people who know you. So those were my two questions, just in general.
Yeah, sure. So I do tend to agree that you should take opportunities to tell them more about yourself when you can. So if you've got something good to share, then do it. If you, with a little bit of creativity and brainstorming, I think most people can have reason to write something compelling in a personal statement and a diversity statement and an optional essay and a character and fitness only when the situation warrants it, obviously. But I wouldn't, for example, let's say you've been arrested for something that you did. I wouldn't make that the personal statement and then not write a character and fitness. I would put that in the character and fitness and find something else to talk about for the personal statement. So automatically, you've been arrested, you did something, or maybe you didn't do something, but you got to disclose it. I wouldn't only make that the personal statement and leave it there. Or if you are not a represented minority, I wouldn't only make that a personal statement. I would probably use the opportunity to make that a diversity statement and talk about that there, and then talk about something else in the personal statement. Or as the previous person said, Mariam was talking about being immigrating to the US, and that as a personal statement, and then talking about something else in the diversity statement. I think most people have the chance to write at least two, and probably three. You could write an addendum for a low GPA or a low LSAT score, potentially, depending on the details. But if you've got a low GPA because your things were going on while you were in college, I wouldn't make it the focus of the personal statement and then not say anything else about yourself. So I do like the idea of taking more opportunities to talk about different topics in more areas. That being said, I wouldn't just aim to fill it up for the sake of filling it up. Don't waste their time with it. But again, with some brainstorming, with some creativity, if you just sit down for an hour and think about the 7 biggest events in your life, you just write down 7 big events that shaped you from the time that you were 2 years old until the present. Most people have 7 major turning points, major life events where things could have gone one way or another way, and everything shifted as a result of that. So if you take some time to think about that, you'll find there's probably 3 good topics right there. So which could be personal statement, diversity statement, then some optional essay or a character and fitness or both. Then the other question regarding who should read your essays. it's all based on the relationships with people you have. So if you've got a good relationship with a professor, then that's a good person to ask. I wouldn't ask them if they don't know you very well, because they're probably not going to put that much effort into it, and they don't know you well enough to really say, does this show who you are? Does this speak to you? At the same time, though, I mean, asking family members or your best friend can be tough because they're not going to want to be critical. So you want people who have a little bit of distance, who aren't going to worry too much about hurting your feelings, and they're going to recognize that it's actually doing you a disservice to just say, oh, it looks great. When in reality, any first draft of writing probably has some major things that could be improved upon significantly with somebody who has a little bit of distance from you giving that feedback.
And then I guess I have one more question. Do you have any experience as far as having like a criminal record and how that affects? Because I know I'm formerly incarcerated, and I know that there's people who applied for law school who are formerly incarcerated and feel that they were kind of pushed aside because they're formerly incarcerated. And so I don't know if you have any experience as far as I think it was viewed a little more negatively towards them. So I never used it in a personal statement before. I didn't use it in undergrad, and so I'm just a little worried about that. But obviously, I'm going to talk about it, but I'm just, if you have any experience as far as that goes.
Yeah, sure. And being incarcerated doesn't automatically mean that you're going to be disqualified from law school. You can still go to law school. If you just Google, you'll see there are people who've been convicted of murder who've gone to law school and become practicing attorneys.
I have friends like that. So I am aware of that, but I just don't know as far as, I don't know. From what I've heard, they've said that a little bit of like, you kind of have to show that you're rehabilitated or something like that. And I just don't know if you have any experience or thoughts on that.
You want to show that you've grown and changed from the experience. And so you could reflect on if you were convicted of something, what you were convicted of. You could talk about what you learned from the experience of being incarcerated or going through the criminal justice system, and lessons learned, showing how you've matured and changed from the person you were back then compared to now. So just showing that growth, being personal. Obviously this could, you have reason to write a character and fitness disclosure. You could also maybe talk about it from a different perspective in the personal statement as well, or you could talk about something else too, depending on what you feel is right. But I would definitely not aim to sugarcoat it. I wouldn't aim to make excuses. I would just aim to explain, this is who I was, this is where I was at the time, this is what led to this circumstance, and this is what I've learned from the experience. This is where I'm at now.
Good, thank you.
Yeah, of course. Got a question in the chat regarding gap years. How do you incorporate your personal when you've taken 1 year off and then you come back, take another year off? I mean, gap years are normal, especially during COVID. A lot of people have gaps in their resumes due to job opportunities or internships falling through, or graduating from college, having a gap. It's fine. I mean, if you have a major gap, that could be a reason to write an addendum, but just be matter of fact about it. I don't see it as being a major problem.
Hi, I have a question. So my question is basically, if you feel like, I know that for your personal statement, you're supposed to write about sort of like why you want to pursue a career in law. But I'm sort of concerned that my why is sort of boring. So would it be bad for me to go off on a tangent to something that's more distantly related to my why?
What's your why, and why is it boring?
I mean, I basically interned for a summer as a constituent services advisor. And while there were like some cases that I had to, navigate the bureaucracy and research for that were like more heartfelt, I don't feel like I could write 2 pages on how they like inspired me. But more of the work I did was more so like little things like HOA disputes, helping the elderly.
I wouldn't automatically dismiss that as being boring. I would take some time to think about the real experiences you have with real people. I mean, constituent services, you're really interacting with members of the public, and you're helping them navigate bureaucracies. And it might seem boring to you because you're doing 1,000 of the same kind of case a lot of times. I've worked as a constituent services intern for a member of Congress, so I have a sense of what it's like. It's like immigration follow-ups and veterans affairs follow-ups and things of that nature, at least in my case. And it can seem routine to you, but it really does have an impact on people's lives. And so if you can think about some of the more emotionally compelling cases that you worked on and people that you helped, and maybe you follow up on their cases for months and months, and eventually you reach a resolution, hopefully a happy one in many cases. You could focus on one or two of those and just talk more about the details of the things that you did.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Just get concrete with it. Get concrete, get specific. It's not, the number, when you're looking at hundreds or thousands of them, it gets boring. But when you talk about one or two, it really becomes more real. So I've got a few notes on things that I could cover related to distinguishing between personal statements and other kinds of statements. But before I do that, I want to just share one example from someone some of you may have seen on social. I recently interviewed a member of the LSAT Unplugged community who got into Harvard Law with a 161, and he had previously worked as a garbage man. So really compelling story. I'll share the YouTube link with you here. One detail that really stood out to me from his experience is that he spent 3 months on his personal statement and went through over a dozen drafts. That's the kind of dedication that you have to have, especially when your numbers aren't telling the full story. But he significantly outperformed his numbers in admissions, and that's obviously not the norm, but in those outlier cases, having a compelling story and really working to refine it and how you talk about it can make a big difference. So I put the link there. Please check it out. It's about 27, 30 minutes, well worth watching just to get the background on his story. And you don't have to have a story as compelling as his. He has a really impressive resume, but just the level of detail he put into it and the level of work he put into it really made a difference. Now, I was thinking about what I would do today if I was going to put together a law school application. And I thought about various stories from my life, my previous experiences, and how I would put them together into different parts of the application. So I've got 3 stories, and I'll just walk through them briefly with you to show how they could fit into those buckets of personal statement, character and fitness, diversity statement, and how I chose to bucket them and bracket them that way. You might do it differently. These stories are my stories, they're not yours, but I've been working to get a little bit more comfortable in getting more personal, which is not something I'm usually very comfortable doing. But I think that especially if I'm helping all of you with your personal statements, I've got to be willing to do that work myself too, just to see how it feels to go deep like that, because it can get uncomfortable, because these are really things that you went through, and then to kind of use them for a personal statement can feel a little bit icky sometimes and feel like you're not really doing it justice. But you got to get over it. That's the thing. You got to get over it, because that's what they're looking for. They're looking for you to share another side of yourself, even if it feels uncomfortable for you. And they're reading hundreds of these, they're reading thousands of these. And it's important to make it personal so it stands out and so it's not boring. So when I see resumes, when I see people laundry listing things, that's boring. People are typically either bragging about things or it's just kind of objective. And the personal statement is really more about getting subjective. It's through your lens. It might not be correct. It might not be right from an objective perspective. It may even feel like this is going to hurt you in some way, but you've got to get vulnerable. And talking about failures is okay. It's about, again, what you learn from the experience. So here's one story that I'll share. And this is a story that came to mind for me as being a personal statement. So I would talk about how I'd spent years teaching classes in person, but a couple of years ago, I started forcing myself to get comfortable being comfortable on video. And you might think that having thousands of followers on social or on a YouTube channel means that you somehow made it. But the truth is that it can actually be quite lonely sometimes. Most people think the numbers mean you've made it and that it's all that. But in reality, it can get worse the more successful that you become, because all these online platforms, they're engineered to getting you obsessed over likes and feedback, to the point where I would have to force myself not to check it right before I go to bed or right after I wake up, to be looking at the comments to see I post something a little bit edgy. What's the feedback? What's the response? They bake it into that, and it's really hard to get away from that. So I've had to force myself to distance in that area. And I've gotten some hate at times for things I've said about the LSAT's importance or about supporting Black Lives Matter. And it can be really hurtful when people leave those nasty comments. So I've been working deliberately to ignore the hateful feedback, to avoid focusing on that can suck you back into constantly checking for everything, and instead simply focus on putting out useful information. And what I found most fulfilling is really, aside from the numbers, that really doesn't matter at all, it's not real, is being on live calls with students and getting to know them, helping them to achieve their dreams. And these one-on-one relationships are more powerful than anything else I've ever encountered. And I'd rather measure my success from that, not the number of views or the number of likes. So that's one idea that came to mind. It might not be my perfect personal statement, but that's a starting point. Those are just some notes I drafted up really quickly before this call, because that's something that's been on my mind a lot lately. And it's real, it's raw. That's where I'd be going with that. Now I've got another story. This story is my character and fitness story. And it involves me getting suspended from college for 2 years when I had a party where we accidentally started a fire because we were wasted. This was drunken foolishness. And it feels really raw for me to be sharing this right now. I'm 35 now. This happened back when I was 20, but it still feels edgy for me to share this. I feel like I could get destroyed over this in some way. For a law school personal statement, I would have to disclose this because I was arrested and being suspended was on my disciplinary record. So I would have to talk about this. Would I want to make this the focus of my personal statement, something stupid I did nearly like 15 years ago? I probably wouldn't want to. I could talk about how during those 2 years off from college, I studied for the LSAT, I started teaching it, but I think that a story like that would be better for a separate essay focusing on the beginnings of my LSAT career. But I wouldn't want to make the focus of my personal statement a story about something stupid I did when I was drunk that had a massive consequence for me. I also wouldn't want to be looking to make excuses for it, like sophomore year of college was really tough, or I had one too many Jell-O shots. I wouldn't want to think about that. I would say very matter-of-factly, here's what I did. I exercised poor judgment. Here's what I learned during those 2 years. Matter of fact, simple, not 500, 600 words, maybe 300 words. And it would be really hard for me to cram that into only 300 words, but I would have to do it. I would maybe write 1,000 words and then very slowly cut it down so that every word counted. I'd be looking at every prepositional phrase, every detail, and making tough choices about what to remove. Now I have a third statement, and this would be a diversity statement. And there are a number of routes one could take about this. I think everybody has multiple things that they could use for a diversity statement. One that comes to mind for me is my own personal spiritual journey. How for a while, I was a hardcore atheist. I underwent a sort of spiritual awakening a few years ago. My path included yoga, meditation, deep work in therapy, and multiple ayahuasca ceremonies under the supervision of shamans in the Amazon. All of this led me to reconsider a lot of previously held beliefs. It would be a wake-up call of sorts. Now, I would be very careful about how I did this because spirituality is edgy. It's a polarizing topic. Talking about psychedelic therapy is not for everybody. You don't want them to think that you're going to abuse drugs. I'm not certainly endorsing that anybody use drugs in any way. I'm just sharing a detail about my personal experience. I might leave that detail out. I might not be totally sure about whether to include it or not. I'd probably talk to multiple current and former admission officers about how exactly whether to disclose a detail like that or not, and I wouldn't make it the focus. But I would include it perhaps because it was the culmination of my journey in that area. But even if I removed it, simply talking about yoga, meditation, deep work in therapy, that alone could be useful. Now, I wouldn't aim to make excuses about things. I wouldn't aim to sugarcoat anything. And I would work very carefully about all the wording and all the details. But it's more about showing how all of those experiences give me a unique perspective, given that there are things that most people haven't undergone. Now, a couple of things I thought of including, but chose not to. One is about growing up in an abusive household, feeling trapped, and how that's impacted me. Now, why didn't I include this? Because I was concerned maybe it could show up as looking for pity. Maybe it's kind of depressing. Instead, if I were to include this, I would talk about how this matured me and what I learned from that experience. But I would think really hard and carefully about, is it the best story I want to tell? Even if it's very important to me, is it serving the purpose of the application specifically? Another story about how I've backpacked and hitchhiked in the Middle East alone for months at a time. Could I talk about that? Sure. Is it unique? Yeah. Is it maturing in various ways? Do I encounter challenges there? Yeah, but it's traveling and lots of people travel. It's not necessarily that unique. They read tons of travel essays all the time and it may not seem different enough. So I decided to leave it out for that reason. Now, I'm happy to take questions on this. I'm not looking to just take questions for the sake of sharing personal things. I'm really looking to take questions more with an angle towards how you could apply this to your application, or if you have questions about the various distinctions here. So I'm happy to open it up to that.
I just have a question about the general workshops that we're going to do with personal statements. Are we going to look at some tonight, or are we going to do that like at a separate time?
Yeah, so I've got a handful pulled up that I do plan to cover tonight. Yeah. And these are, yeah, of course. And these are statements that were submitted to me through the LSAT Unplugged Facebook group and Instagram, with people knowing that this would be later published on YouTube and the podcast and various other channels. So I do have a handful pulled up tonight, and that's actually the next thing I want to get to, unless there are any other questions from folks here.
I guess talking about the diversity statement, I really had written off that a diversity statement would apply to me because I'm a white cisgender female, but you know, I guess I'm realizing more and more of the aspects as I look into it might apply to me. So do you have any advice about maybe picking, you know, one that's as compelling, or if they're a couple to incorporate it, or, you know, limiting that maybe, I guess?
Yeah, sure. It doesn't have to be related to race or ethnicity or your orientation in any way. It could be a totally different angle altogether. And those are going to be different for every single person. I just mentioned one that came to mind for me. I could talk about being Jewish. I probably wouldn't, because Jews are overrepresented. So that's not really going to get me a lot of points in various areas. I probably wouldn't go that angle. I'd find something else in my case. But I would think about what's something unique that you bring to the table that may not be represented fully.
I'm also struggling kind of with writing the diversity statement, because I feel as though that, you know, although I want to share some of the unique things that I would bring to the table, I kind of feel like it's turning out to be a sob story, and like I don't want to do that. So I'm wondering, do you have like any advice on how I would like address some really, I guess, difficult or edgier topics, but do it in a way that's, you know, incorporating the resiliency, but doing it so that it's related to law and bringing it back to what I'm actually trying to do?
Yeah, sure. Well, first off, I wouldn't say a diversity statement has to bring it back to law at all. So I would put that idea aside. I would think more specifically about what's a unique perspective that you bring. And you could talk about, if you faced hardships, you could talk about those. But I would think more about how it's giving you a unique perspective, and how maybe through some anecdotes, you can show that you look at things a little bit of a different way.
Yeah, by anecdotes though, when you're trying to write something like that, it shouldn't be like punchliney. It shouldn't be something like a metaphor that could, I mean, I guess you could do a metaphor, but I'm just afraid that if I go too, you know, abstract, that people aren't going to get it, and that the applications people may look at me like, what is this girl talking about? Is she okay? You know, so how much is too much?
It's all based on the examples. I'd have to look at specifics with you. And since you're in the course, we could do that another time. But the idea is that you talk about your things you've experienced, given your unique background, given your unique perspective, and how you would bring something unique to any room you walk into based upon that.
Yeah, definitely. And I feel like this is also just to open up to the people here too, because I'm sure a lot of people feel this way with diversity statements, that not only is it kind of like that imposter syndrome when you're writing this, but there's kind of that, I guess, feeling of just being, maybe it's not adequate enough, or not, you know, whatever, but kind of dismissing those feelings of, you know, this was a hardship, or this was something that I could bring to the table, but then feeling like, no, like, you know, there's so many people that I know that's so resilient, and they've struggled and really overcome it. So who am I? Like, what really do I bring, you know? So how do you guys overcome that?
I think something that really stood out to me, that even Steve mentioned earlier on this call, is like, anything that has to do with real people and real experiences. And when I really put in the time and thinking about it, I get more detailed, I realize that I have a full, you know, obligation to show up as powerfully as I can. Like, my experiences completely matter. I have full agency here on the earth. And the more detail I get with myself, I guess the real thing is, the more honest I am with myself, the easier it gets to feel confident about it, because it's real.
I would add too, also research. You mentioned earlier, when you go to an institution because you're spending your money, you want to see what kind of faculty and staff you have. As a graduate student, what I found, even when I had to conduct my grad research, even though I used everyone within my graduate program, there were several of my classmates who had to write their thesis with outside professors within the university. So, you know, that's something you want to think about. You know, if I'm going to go to this school, if they have a study abroad program, how do you fit within that? Like, every one of us has a skill set. You know, we are going to add values to wherever we go. And, you know, keep in mind too, if you want to, you know, be conduct environmental justice, you might want to go to Vermont, right? Law school. Or if you want to deal with entertainment law, maybe you want to go to UCLA. So you know where you want to go. Focus on that because it's so crucial and so important for you. You are valuable. So when you utilize your personal statements and your personal story, tie that in. Like, I remember writing about Lima Gobi, which was this, I'm an African-American woman, never been to Africa before. But when I saw her on PBS and I was like, they're not elderly, but they're older women protesting and they're wearing all white. And, it really inspired me, and I was really passionate about that. But when I wrote that in my personal statement, they didn't, I didn't include whether or not I went to Africa. It was just like this TV segment that inspired me to want to fight for, women's rights, human security, things like that. So I hope that helps. And, personal statements are important, but definitely tie that into a professor who's already doing research, maybe, sometimes reach out to those professors ahead of time. Hey, I'm thinking about going to the school. I know when I wanted to do research in Mozambique, I reached out to a professor across the country and, she was doing research, and so things like that, if you have time, that's my advice, because when they're reading your admissions letter, they want to know, like, you're serious about these things. And don't be afraid to call them too ahead of time. Sometimes you're a little bit shy about calling people. I know the GRE has it. I'm not sure about the LSAT, but it's like the GRE had a character strength type of survey. And so that's what I use to get in my graduate program. So I basically had people anonymously, or people I knew, they just talked about my character. I didn't get to see it, but the school saw it. So that's my advice. I hope it helps.
Thank you so much, Mariah. And thank you, Alyssa. For me as a Canadian, I think we only have the LSAT here. I don't know about the GRE, but that is something to take into account. So thank you for those notes.
Hey, thanks, Mariah. And then Alyssa, Rianka, did you have something to share as well?
I was just going to say really quickly about the imposter syndrome. Just remember that you have a specific point of view that even though a lot of people may or may not have gone through that same sort of thing, you're the one that's trying to pursue it in law. Like, for me, I'm coming from an animal background. Like, I was a zookeeper. And there's a lot of people that are in the zookeeping industry that are super angry about how animals are treated, not necessarily just in the United States, but worldwide. But it doesn't mean that those people are the ones that are trying to do something about it in the legal setting. So you have to remember that even though they may or may not hold that same perspective or have gone through similar things, that you're saying that I not only represent myself, but I represent a lot of other people too. Now I'm going to be the one that's going to take the steps into getting some of that change to happen. I hope that helps.
Thank you.
That's great. And back to the imposter syndrome itself. I mean, that alone could be a great topic for a diversity statement or a personal statement, talking about walking into the room and feeling like you don't deserve to be there. And how you feel there's that perception that everyone else does. And because of XYZ reasons, you might not feel that you're worthy to be there. When in reality, if you look more objectively, of course, your accomplishments dictate that you do deserve to be there. Even just that alone, you could do something with that. So how do you all feel about looking at some personal statements? I've got a handful pulled up here. Again, these were all submitted over social, Facebook, and Instagram. Everyone agreed to have their statements shared with others. So here's a link to a Google Drive file, a PDF, containing 4 personal statements from the LSAT Unplugged Facebook group and Instagram followers. And so let's take a look. All right, so here's the first one I loaded up for tonight. Dear Director of Admissions, Whitney Dashley, if I'm saying that correctly. Quote, each time a woman stands up for herself without knowing it possibly, without claiming it, she stands up for all women. Maya Angelou. I'm applying to the Sanford Cumberland University Juris Doctor program for fall admission. I chose this program specifically because of your competitive trial team has 9 women as representatives, and after researching the Women in Law chapter, I found it to be a strong alliance of professionally driven women who support each other in the stresses of life and law school. I always wanted to be a lawyer. I took my first step at following my dream in 2009 However, it was clear life still had much to teach me before I could truly understand, so I followed opportunity and necessity to gain more experience. As a child and well into adulthood, I was wayward and brusque. Though charming and endearing to many, it was a way for me to buck the system, rebel against etiquette and the boring ways you are taught to live. This wayward disposition garnered me an invitation into the world of sales, and it was organic to me. Speaking to people, reading them, and then anticipating their next move was as easy as breathing. And I soon earned the reputation of sales beast, an endearing term in the trade meant to identify that I was unrelenting and always had my eye on the prize. After many years of a successful career, I started noticing I wasn't acquiring actual skills. I brought my natural skills to the table, but I wasn't growing, learning, or fulfilling my original goals. I was making good money at Wells Fargo. However, what I was doing wasn't compelling. I felt like a cog in a machine. I grew up in an apartment in Manassas, Virginia, hope I'm saying that correctly, with my mother, stepfather, and brother. While our needs were met, I didn't know until later in life we weren't even considered middle class. College wasn't talked about. Actually going to the dentist wasn't even talked about. My mother did well as a woman with dyslexia and a 4th grade reading level. She worked her way up to become an executive housekeeper at a well-known hotel and still works there after 30 years. My biological father in the Navy was usually on a ship and did what he could from far away. I knew what I loved. Education was not important. What I was supposed to aspire to was marriage and a blue-collar job. It was glamorized in the country ballads we listened to then. Cursing was normal. Fried food was normal. Yelling was normal. Holes in drywall, normal. Reading was not, which I did a lot to my mother's horror. I remember the first time I was told what a lawyer was. I was 10. I came home from school and told my mother about a court case we reviewed in current events. The case was about abortion. As a completely new concept for me, I was appalled. How could someone end a baby's life? In my exasperation, I called my father in Florida and argued with him about pro-life versus pro-choice for an hour. At 10, I was told I should be a lawyer one day. At 10, I decided maybe I should. Time has changed my views towards abortion, the complexities of life, maturation, and a larger worldview has clarified my perception of women's rights in general. I am also recently a single mom, and this has clarified my perception of women's rights in general. I'm also recently a single mom, and this has further expanded my understanding about opportunity and vulnerability for women in the United States. I have 2 children, a boy and a girl. This year began with me as a stay-at-home mother, married to a soldier, getting ready to move our family to Fort Stewart, Georgia. I was excited as it was our very first move. My son was 17 and my daughter had just turned 2. We all relocated and it was a tiring experience to move all our belongings 10 hours away. I was excited about what this new adventure could bring. It was nice there and I began settling in after a month or so. That's when my husband came home for lunch and told me he wanted a divorce. No fight, no discussion, no prior fighting, just it's over and I'm moving into a friend's house. You have a month to move out. I didn't cry. That's all I remember. I rallied friends, family, and said about the work of moving and the logistics it would take to get us back to Virginia where my family lived. I'm going to stop there because this is longer than it needs to be. It's longer than a typical personal statement. A personal statement should be 2 pages, double spaced, typically. And I think we have enough here that we can already start critiquing it and giving feedback. So what are some early thoughts you all have about this one?
Okay, I wrote down a couple notes here just to kind of go through. The narrative started to get a little bit choppy at the end when she started to talk about the drywall and then that I was a lawyer and the pro-life choice. Just make sure that those transition words are there. They don't have to be a therefore or furthermore. They just have to flow in a cohesive way. And as well as I don't understand where the why comes in. Like how does all of those experiences, which are extremely, this person is very strong. They understand why to some extent they are applying in the beginning. They started off that way, but they never related back their experiences to that why again. And so I was looking for that and I just didn't see it. So that's something to think about.
Agreed 100%. Thank you for that. Other feedback?
I feel like there was too much going on. With everything that was said, if she would have been a little more zoned in on one specific, it was hard to follow even reading it, even having you read it. So I just think there was just a lot going on.
Yeah, there's a lot here. There's too much here. It's covering too many different topics in one place. It's like she feels the need to cram in her entire life story in this one statement, which you certainly don't want to do. It shouldn't even be a resume laundry list, let alone a life laundry list here. So I think there's way too many things here. I agree that, as one comment said, it should be split into two statements at least.
Yeah, there's no real, like, there's not like a narrative thread that you can follow through this. You know, like what I would say before you even get into the way that it's written, like the quality of the writing itself, like the content needs to be more well established before you even get to that point. Like, I honestly would probably scrap the whole thing and just zero in on like what's the one key thing, or what's the change, like what's the main story point that you want to emphasize in the personal statement.
Yeah, pick one thing and focus on it. And there's some questions here around the abortion comment, whether the author should lead with abortion, or maybe if that's not the why, maybe remove it altogether. If abortion's super important to you, you could talk about it, but otherwise I would probably aim to stay away from really hot button controversial topics like that if it's not going to add a whole lot. So things like abortion, affirmative action, Israel versus Palestine. If that's your number one passion topic, then by all means pick it, and the schools that will punish you for it, you probably don't want to go there anyway, whichever side you choose. But otherwise, if it's not really core to it, I wouldn't throw it in there as an aside. And being someone at the age of 10 who loves to argue is not a great reason to go to law school, whether abortion's the debate topic or not. Either way, who you are at 10 doesn't mean you should be a lawyer.
Yeah, also, oh, sorry. Does someone else want to say something?
It's fine. Go ahead. I'll go after you.
Okay, sorry. Thank you. Can we talk about the sales beast comment just really quick? Yeah. I'm just wondering, like, I do know that this is probably a term, and she does explain that, but is that necessary? I know she's trying to convey, possibly, I'm just assuming here, you know, that this is something that, you know, she's done well in the sales industry, but is it worth diving in so deep where it's talking about the specifics and then, you know, calling yourself a sales beast? How does that look in terms of, you know, the admissions process?
That's a good question. Yeah, I think it may, that term, which I'm certainly not familiar with either, although I get what she's getting at there based on the context. If it's going to confuse a little bit, even for a moment, it pulls you out of the flow. So I wouldn't focus on that. If you alternatively want to have a statement focused on what you learned from working in sales and the people skills there, you could highlight that through an anecdote and make that the focus of a personal statement. Or I see some things here related to family, like having kids, getting divorced, being a single mom. That could be a great topic, perhaps, for a diversity statement. That could be a separate bucket to place that particular topic in, to allow one to focus on that and go deeper on it.
I wonder if it's a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, she started talking about the female trial team. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, I was just gonna say, I'm wondering if it's a good idea to, it seems like she's a little bit condescending towards like country music and fried food, which aren't necessarily my cup of tea, but I don't know if they're the admissions officer's cup of tea. I wouldn't want to like put them I wouldn't want to sound that way to someone.
That's a good point. Yeah, you don't want to unnecessarily potentially alienate someone without a good reason to do so. I wouldn't assume too much about the person reading your application. They're automatically going to agree with your worldview. You don't know who they are, and that could rub them the wrong way potentially, certainly.
I also think the paragraph where she mentions about like she's 10 and then how she doesn't have that concept, and then all of a sudden she starts talking about how she was on a call with her dad about, you know, pro and praise. I mean, that might add confusion to certain people who are reading about, or she's saying she doesn't know, but then she's talking about it at the same time. So what do you think about that?
I'm guessing that abortion probably doesn't need to be in this personal statement at all. It seems like it's thrown in as an aside, as a particular example, to say that because she was 10 and liked arguing, that was the beginning of her legal career. I think it's unnecessary. I would probably remove that altogether.
The intro also to the after the quote, the third paragraph, as a child and well into adulthood, I was wayward and brusque. Those like first two sentences, they seem not well connected to the paragraph, or they don't seem to have much of a point.
Yeah. The flow here is not smooth. It sounds like she just wanted to use those words to describe herself. But again, first of all, I would say you don't want to seem like you're bragging. You also if you want to communicate those aspects of your personality, I would show that rather than telling that directly. And so if you want to talk about your personality, maybe through the sales experience, as she later mentions, I would do that. And I don't know if we addressed this directly yet, but yeah, don't start with quotes. Never start with quotes. I'm not a fan of quotes, as I said in the previous workshop I did for my course. Anytime I see a quote, I'm going to want to take it out. Maybe if it's dialogue in a conversation that you had, maybe it could go there. But if it's just a generic quote that anybody could be using, I would remove it. Every word should be core to the story. And if it's taking up 10 words in the space of 500 or so, it's not worth mentioning.
There's also...
Sorry, just a quick note. I think like building off of that in terms of the structure of the personal statement, I don't know if everyone would agree, but I would definitely take out like the quote like you just mentioned, Steve, and also just the first two paragraphs, and maybe start with the one after that, just because it doesn't seem like it would add much to the statement the way it is. And also another thing that I noticed is that I think as I was listening to it the first time, a lot of it just seemed very abstract. There was a lot of abstract language that was being used with a few experiences sprinkled in here and there, but I was having a hard time kind of focusing on concrete parts of her life, given how they were kind of meshed with like other types of language that didn't necessarily like relate to that.
Yeah, agreed. The first two paragraphs here, I would cut those. I would probably cut the entire statement and start over, as I think Janine was saying. The first statement, I'm applying to blah, blah, blah. I chose this program because blah, blah, blah. Yeah, all of that's generic. It doesn't add anything. They already know you're applying to their JD program. They already know that you think their program is great. That's a given. Don't waste time on that. Start over. I would maybe, again, talk about a couple of potential routes to take. Sales experience, focus on that as one essay. Experience as a single mother, focus on that as a separate essay. And those could be maybe a diversity statement. And I would focus on those most likely here. I'm just scanning through here to see if anything else jumps out based on personal experience. And I would start with those two most likely here, unless there's something else. We don't have this person's resume, so we don't know what else she might do with it. One quick side note here. I heard this come up in our previous Q&A as well, the idea about legal battles you might have, especially legal battles that relate to family. So legal battles over kids, legal battles related to divorce. It's very easy to feel bitter about those experiences and feel wronged, and to talk a lot about your personal battles and the injustice of whatever occurred. Be very careful about that, because it gets a little bit too personal, a little bit too raw. And if you haven't fully processed it and come to a place where you're okay with whatever the outcome is, and maybe it's not an okay outcome and you're right to feel how you feel, that's fine, but that may not be the place to have that battle on the application. So just tread very carefully in that area. Definitely have other people read it over and think about what you're trying to get across and what's the role of the statement, not just what's the right versus wrong in terms of the injustice of what may have happened. Any other feedback on this one, or should we go on to the next?
I just have a quick question before we go on.
Sure.
I know that you said to cut off the paragraph with the competitions and everything, but could she make it so that, for example, she does mention debate and the pro-life and all of that, that she says, because of my experience in debating, and I see that you guys have this strong debate club, and I have these experiences that made me a strong woman. Could she frame it in that way where it's like, it makes sense that she would want to go to the school because of the competitive trial team, because of her experiences, because she is, inspired by this? Could that work?
It could. And if it ties into the topic of the personal statement, maybe as a closer, that could be mentioned. Otherwise, I might do a separate essay depending on the school, saying why that school in particular, to show that you've done the research on the nature of their programs and that to communicate how serious you are about their school in particular. But I certainly wouldn't open with that, because that's probably the most boring thing you could open with and have it still be like decent content. I would instead really get personal from the beginning. And then if you want to zoom out at the end, talking about as I debated let's say, just say debated in sales or made arguments in sales, clearly organized arguments about the pros and cons of various options for the client. And then at the end, talk about this program, this trial team, maybe. But I would do that at the end, if anything.
Hi, Steve. I just have a quick question about the author and how she or he talked about, I guess, work experiences. And I was just wondering whether or not the resume already covers that and whether or not that's applicable in a personal statement.
Yeah, well, we don't have this person's resume here, and I haven't seen this person's resume, so I don't know exactly what the resume is covering. But I would imagine it probably covers the sales experience if that was a full-time position, at least, even a part-time position maybe. I guess the risk people run into is that they want to list everything from their resume in the personal statement, and that prevents them from going deep. Let the resume be the resume and let the personal statement be personal. And that means going deeper on ideally one particular thing.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, of course. All right, let's go to number 2 here. And let's see this one, the length. All right, I'll probably read the whole thing. My 2 earliest memories are being forced into a hot garage by my family and earning a blue generic first place convenience store ribbon at a local high school's dance camp. Consequently and respectively, I remember my 2 earliest thoughts being, these people aren't nice around here and I'm a pretty good dancer, aren't I? By the age of 8, I had devised a plan to escape my abusive home. I would become a professional dancer. I created a nutritional plan for myself and memorized balletic positions with books I borrowed from my elementary school library. I recall a particularly humiliating incident when my librarian's voice chimed in cadence with the machine's beep played by the swiping of my book across its laser. I had reached the recheckout limit and must leave the dance books with her immediately. She must have held her palm out to me for me to surrender, but all I feel in the memory is her tugging the books from my limb. I took to creating mixtape CDs and coordinated each song with a specific activity meant to further me along in my goals. One song was for cardio, the next for stretching, the last for strength. Around the same time that I was spending hours in my room performing sit-ups and stretching splits, my father was deployed to Kuwait in the post-September 11th crisis. His absence announced itself with a swelling of my mother's agitation and punishments. I was afraid of her on the day that I had removed my outer sweater and revealed a worn t-shirt meant to stay unseen at school without her permission. We are Hispanic, and that day it was pressed into me that we must always wear shirts with collars or keep our sweaters on to not garner any negative attention or rumors about our ethnicity. I was 10 years old and acutely aware that my misstep of improper clothing brought shame to the family, and the fear of my mother's temper grew. Tension thickened in my home with my temporarily single mother, so I danced to pervade my focused goals into existence. That summer, I volunteered to assist youth classes, attend my own, and anchor the day's training with the most advanced classes saved for the teenagers. Those days lasted from about 1:30 to 10 p.m., and I did this 5 days a week. I declined acquaintance birthday party invitations on the weekends, saving those days for training. On weekends, I plunged into the studio as early as 5:30 in the morning and hovered until the last dance ran at 5:30 in the evening. By age 13, I began to accept scholarships to train in both New York and Los Angeles in the summers. It was my senior year in high school when the physical violence in my house escalated. One school night, my father took a trash bag and had me place all of my dance clothing inside of it. This is his gambit. I watched him take a hammer to a few of my items. He had to place the item down and hit it multiple times, chase after the item, place it back down, and hit again. He took scissors to monetary symbols and other paperwork. While he performed these acts meant to terrorize, I used my imagination, and after choosing a Southern California university to attend in the fall, I pored over its website and introducing myself to the awards given out to classes before mine. I visualized myself receiving the Outstanding Freshman Dancer of the Year award, while my father's hammer lugged. One school night close to my high school graduation, my sleep is punctured by the lights coming up in my room. My mother is very angry with me and she takes to physical action while I'm still tangled in my blankets. As she slapped me, I concentrated on my potential. The university I'd be attending was so proximal to Los Angeles, I harbored focus for the monumental change it could provide for me. By the end of my time at X University, I received the Outstanding Freshman Dancer of the Year Award, Phoenix Award, Outstanding Choreographer, and Outstanding Performance Awards. I moved to Los Angeles, where I was cast as a soloist for an experimental opera. It took place downtown, and when I arrived on set, I properly vacated my breakfast in the trash bin next to my dressing trailer. I'd been eating from expired sets of pre-made meals my coworkers from my retail job tossed out to save on grocery bills. Years of eating expired foods and retail working ensued until my summit wholly presented itself. I became a principal dancer for XYZ Company. It is the only full-time dance company for classically trained multi-form dancers in the United States. And no one came to our shows. Our audiences were at 10% capacity. We were dancing for no one. An interviewer for the show asked me how it felt to represent myself as a Hispanic woman, and I thought of the migrant children detained at our southern borders. I thought of how far away I felt from them and how I was reprimanded for wearing a dirty t-shirt to school at a young age, in fear of resembling them or being confused for an immigrant. The same year, I left my role as a principal dancer in pursuit of a more meaningful use of my gifts. I experienced my father's hands around my neck for the first time. When he choked me, I experienced powerlessness. That event left me unable to ignore the call to action for those who cannot evade their hardships with dancing. My ironclad grip on the vision for myself shifted. What if the years of dedication to a craft, severe discipline, and ability to imagine a better future could be transformed into protecting the rights of others? Could my survival be proof that I can help others when their power has been taken away from them? And could I embrace my Hispanic ethnicity for what it brings with its privileges and confusion? I need to make the world a safer place for someone who looks like me, and I need to wedge myself between those children and their abusers detaining them. Wow, this one's powerful. Feedback, thoughts? One comment, yeah, go ahead, please.
I was going to say, after hearing you read this one out loud, it almost feels like there's like little tidbits of things that, like, I know somebody wrote could be a diversity statement, but it's like a little bit about being Hispanic, a little bit about being a dancer, a little bit about abuse. And I'm just curious if this falls into the category of like talking about too many things, or maybe is better as a diversity statement.
That's a great comment. Yeah. I could see this being divided into multiple statements as well. There's a lot going on here. And I think the material here is really powerful. And I think that the specifics, the details really make it come to life. I found this one very emotionally compelling. And especially in contrast to the previous one, I feel like this one's getting closer to what I would love to see because it's so personal. I agree with the comment in the chat that it reads as a diversity statement. I see that angle there. And that could come, there's multiple references to ethnicity being Hispanic. So that could be drawn out in certain ways, especially the references to clothing, like the idea of clothing and stereotypes coming in. That could be drawn out and you could go deeper on that in a separate statement, potentially. And then you could also, I'm thinking this person could take the dance as a separate statement. They could take the abuse as a separate statement as well. So there's a lot of routes that someone could take with this. And then I also see a comment here about the dancing jargon. So if is there too much dancing jargon here? Maybe. I think the different awards being listed, I wouldn't necessarily need the parentheses, or I wouldn't even need the list of the laundry list of awards there either.
I also kind of was missing a little bit of the why. I think they had a really powerful story, but they didn't, again, relate it back to law school and like why that has, I know at the end they kind of mentioned that, but it was like, and then I want to go to law school because of this. It should be kind of incorporated in a way where they tie it in with some of the things that they've experienced and the resiliency that came out of being in that situation and how they overcame that.
Yeah, it does feel kind of thrown in at the end. And there are two routes that you could take. You could either remove that last bit altogether because it doesn't necessarily need to be directly tied back, or the idea of simply sympathizing with others who are abused, having gone through abuse oneself. That alone could be enough.
And it reads like a creative writing. So like if you're a creative writer and you have an imagination, you can definitely piece it together. So if you're not like a one-track mind person, you can definitely see how it goes. But I think for, admissions, you want to tie everything in, but you want to be a little bit more detailed because everyone's mind isn't the same. So I could imagine as I was reading this, as she's saying this person slapping me, like if you watch film, if you're really into film analysis, you would imagine this person getting slapped and their imagination going to another place. And you can imagine that. But as but for everyone doesn't, when they read, they don't actually, you know, conduct that in their mind. They're just like, what? I don't get it. So I definitely get it, but it's not too much. It's just like you were saying earlier about how you decided not to disclose abuse and for various reasons. You know, it's kind of like, okay, you're talking about this. So like everyone was saying, like, why law school? You know, like, you know, because this is a touchy topic. And then how they talked about immigration, which is important. It would have been nice to hear a little bit more about like, oh, you wear dirty clothes. Well, why did you wear dirty clothes? You know, like what was going on? I don't hear anything about economic diversity. So I don't know if you grew up poor. You know, you can't assume that because you went through domestic violence, you were poor. But I know you're poor because you wore a dirty shirt. Or maybe you weren't, you know, so you don't really get to, as this person is telling us about their life, you know, it's already, it would have been nice to hear a little bit more. But she couldn't put all of that in there at one time. So I don't know if that helps.
I think the next step for this person, because she has a lot of, again, those experiences and the analogies, I would say cut the analogies, be concise, because when you're saying respectfully and consequently, that's basically saying the same thing. So just kind of check with like the grammar that everything is cohesive in that way to cut down. But also, I would say that particularly for this person, why you have to, you know, when you go through an experience, just like write down and jot like what the experience has, you know, made you. Has it made you more resilient? Are you now more empathetic to when other victims come forward about their own abuse, right? So like, yes, you can talk about, you know, domestic violence, but I think that this person for their next step needs to say, you know, how has this shaped me as a person? And how is this going to shape me in my career?
Yeah, I think there's room to cut some of the details that pull us out of the story and some of the language as well. Like if the language is too formal and it's too professional, I mean, it's great to show the use of vocabulary sometimes, but it can go too far at other times and pull us out of the moment and pull us out of the emotion. So yeah, I agree that if someone's using two words when one will do, or using a more advanced word when a simpler word will do, that's, I think, some room for improvement. I'm thinking about some of the details as well. Like, this is the only full-time dance company and no one came to our shows. Like, that's interesting, but does it really matter in terms of a personal statement? That's just a detail in this person's life. I find that the details of like eating expired food that other people threw out, like that's a way to indicate hardship. It's a way to indicate poverty. And I see more reason to include that than the fact that the dance company isn't that popular. But then the dirty t-shirt, again, another personal detail that at least makes it come to life more, where we can picture the author in that situation.
Yeah, I got something else from the fact that the dance company wasn't really having a big audience. Like when you continue to do something like time after time without necessarily like the glory, like she says with the awards, or like with like the fame of doing it, but like for the passion of doing it and applied passion like standard. I don't know if that makes sense.
I get what you mean. Yeah, that's a good angle on it, and I could imagine the author had that as a reason to mention this as well. I guess the point is like, how many different things can you communicate in one personal statement? Is that you're dancing for the love of the craft? Is that you're dancing and winning awards despite poverty and hardship? Is it that you dance to process the abuse that you've suffered? Is that an outlet for it? There's a lot of routes that you could take with it, but there's only so many things you can put into one statement. And I would think that it's possible to tighten this up enough where a lot of those things can be communicated, but we have to make it really clear and make it flow and avoid so much of the chronology being the orientation. I'd rather have a theme that ties it together than simply chronology being it. Like, I was here, I moved there. When I got here, here's what happened next. And those statements that just or like, this happened, then that happened, then this other thing happened, it can feel kind of disjointed and feel like you're trying to summarize everything. And I'm thinking back to the previous statement we covered, where that statement, I think, really suffered from this and that and this other thing. And yeah, maybe they happened in that exact order, but if there's no theme tying them together, it's going to feel like, as someone said, feel choppy. I'm going to read another comment here in the chat. Ram is asking, I asked why when asked about how it was to represent herself as an Hispanic woman, why did that spark her to think of immigrants detained at the borders? There's a connection missing there. How does she go from using dance as an escape from abuse to thinking about migrants? I agree that that connection wasn't that clear to me either. We have the interviewer for the show asking that question. And the author thought of the migrant children detained. And then being in fear of resembling them or being confused as a migrant with a dirty t-shirt. So I see that as being the connection here, but I agree that it's not that smooth and it feels like it's kind of thrown in there, given the surrounding context is all about the dancing.
For me personally, one of the things that stood out to me about this piece was just like that, I guess like that analogy between, how she worked hard into becoming a dancer. I just feel like you just draw so much correlation between going to law school and working while I feel that you can just draw so much analogy between being a dancer and going to law school. I mean, not everyone can be a dancer. That takes a lot of commitment. That just takes a lot of effort to do. And I believe that just kind of demonstrates to, like a grad school or a law school, that you're able to, not only work hard, but also to achieve. So I think that's just something that maybe emphasize more.
Yeah. I think it just needs to be tied together more. Any other comments on this one? All right. Well, thanks for everyone for sharing feedback on this one. I had a few others loaded up for tonight, just in case we got to them. I think I'm going to leave off here with the personal statements for now. And next time we'll continue with the other ones, maybe in a week or two. In the meantime, though, does anyone have any general questions on personal statements, anything else that we didn't get to, or any other questions that came up as a result of our discussion over the course of the evening?
I had one more quick question that kind of is tying along with some of the stuff that was talked about in the chat. So should we be referencing in our personal statement anything that occurred in like very recent months, so in the past 3 to 6 months? Is this something that should be discussed at all in the personal statement? And if so, I would assume it should not be like a central part of our personal statement, but rather something that's brought up closer to the end.
That's a good question. Yeah, I think that if it's fairly recent, that doesn't necessarily disqualify it. But I would tie it back to something a little bit older, just so that doesn't feel like law school is a sudden half-baked idea. I think that's a risk that you run. And then on the flip side, as was said in the chat, like you don't want to go back to high school or earlier. You want to keep it fairly recent enough that it reflects who you are as an adult, not necessarily going back to like childhood events and only focusing on childhood. So I would avoid those extremes too much, but it's okay to talk about recent events, certainly.
Okay, thank you. And just a really quick follow-up to that, is it also, like, would it be viewed negatively if we decide not to bring up these things if they don't directly relate to the story that we want to talk about in the personal statement?
You're asking if it's okay to not bring up these things?
Yeah, like, do they have to be directly referenced in essence? I think I'm having a hard time balancing whether it's something that should be, like, whether recent events should be referenced or whether they shouldn't be.
Can you give me an example of what you mean by recent events?
Sure. I mean, essentially, like, we know that, every law school has, and every student has been affected by events such as COVID, Black Lives Matter movement, etc. But I'm just debating whether or not, like, if I have a specific story in mind that I already wanted to tell, and it may not be in direct relation to very recent events, is it okay to basically not bring them up, or would that be seen as, kind of being too removed from what's been happening?
Oh, no, I think it's fine not to mention them. I think the risk is actually the opposite, where people mention them too much. So I think they're going to get tons of COVID personal statements, tons of Black Lives Matter statements, tons of statements referencing Trump, and those can become cliche very quickly. And so if you don't have a good reason to mention them, definitely don't. And if you're thinking of mentioning them, make sure you have a very good reason for doing so that isn't going to be cliche.
Okay, got it. Yeah, that was the main thing I was just trying to figure out. Like, I was worried that if I didn't reference it at all, it would make it seem like I just haven't been paying attention in the past 6 months. But it seems like there's a bigger risk if you do decide to mention it.
Yeah, no, they're going to know that you're aware of COVID. Don't worry.
Yeah, okay, thanks to you.
Yeah, of course. All right, folks. Well, thanks for all the great questions, the great feedback. I think we covered a lot of good ground tonight. If you have other questions or follow-ups, feel free to reach out, and I'll be happy to do whatever I can to help them. We'll have another event like this soon. So have a good night, everyone, and thanks for joining. Bye, all.
Thanks, Steve. Bye.
Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.